So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the final session, and of course we are running a little bit late, so we're going to be extremely swift and brief. But I think we've had an excellent introduction to this session in the final remarks of President de Klerk, who's talked about understanding the causes of mistrust, understanding the causes of terrorism and anger around the world. And it is exactly this that we'll be focusing on, looking at how we break down mistrust between groups within societies. It is one of the key problems for all governments now. As we heard earlier in this conference, most conflicts nowadays are not between countries, but are within countries. And they are conflicts fueled by ethnic, religious, and cultural misunderstandings. These conflicts, sadly, are growing. It is a sad fact that religion is playing an ever larger part, not in causing conflicts, but in being used by people, misused, as a badge under which they are pursuing their own political disagreements. I think we have some excellent speakers who are well qualified to understand this problem, particularly starting with our first speaker, Mairead Corrigan Maguire, whose campaign against the misunderstanding and misuse of religion was one of the fundamental things that spoke to the rest of the world about the problems in Northern Ireland, where sadly there are still walls in Belfast separating communities. It is the case in most countries now that we have a conflict of clash of culture among some groups that have migrated into Western Europe, where religion has been misused as a badge for extremism. This is not only dangerous in itself, but it is even more dangerous in that people then take those groups and that religion, in particular Islam, as being somehow connected with extremism, and that tarnishes a whole community, which is extremely destabilizing, worrying, and a slight to human dignity. How to reach across these barriers is going to be the theme of our brisk and brief session, and I would ask Mairead Corrigan Maguire to begin. Thank you very much.
In Northern Ireland, when the Troubles started, we had a deep ethnic political problem. There was majoritarianism, which is not democracy, and a minority had no basic civil rights, and this is what was the root of our problems when they started in the mid-60s in Northern Ireland. Now, I think it brings a lot of questions to the fore. What is democracy? Where do we really have democracy? What do you do about ethnic groups that don't have rights within all our different traditions? Now, had we had real political leadership at the time and a sense of community and trust, we could have moved forward to solve our problems. They were solvable. They were political problems with political solutions. But tragically, what happened was fear set in, and because we lived in separate communities and had never worked together to trust each other, violence came into the situation. And you know, once guns come into any situation, it becomes impossible to entangle the situation and begin to solve the real issues of justice and human rights and equality that communities are faced with. So our message in Northern Ireland when we started a peace movement was to quite simply say that paramilitarism, terrorism, state violence, abusing human rights and removing basic civil liberties was not solving our problem. Indeed, violence was taking us round in circles, and we had to cut and stop using the violence. So our first message would be, don't bring in guns to any ethnic political conflict, because they only frighten people and they can't then dialogue. What they do is they separate into different communities. So that was the first message. These deep ethnic political problems, which we're seeing all over the world, will not be solved with guns and militarism and removing basic civil rights and human rights. It won't be solved. Yeah. So we struggle now to say in Northern Ireland we still have walls. We have our peace process, our devolved government, our power-sharing executive, but we still have walls up between the communities because the communities separated, polarised because there were too many guns and they became frightened. We have got to bring the communities together again, to re-knit the communities, and that's going to take a long time. The people who can help do that, indeed, are the different faith traditions, because we have a multicultural, multi-faith society. So the different faith traditions working together. But they can do it when they articulate the real traditions of their founders, i.e. reconciliation, peace, non-violence. So we need faith traditions to work together to help people bring out the very best in them and to work with believers and non-believers. But I think there's one important wall we have to bring down when we're talking about ethnic political conflict. And that's the wall of them and us. That's the wall that says there's good people and there's bad people. There's no such thing as good people and bad people. There are people who sometimes get confused and because of their situation start using violence. But so we have got to say use non-violence, but we must recognize the right of people to non-violently resist injustice. That's an important right to people. So I do think that in trying to re-knit the communities again, that we recognize it can only be done one-to-one, community to community, and civil community building that democracy from the bottom up, literally, and reclaiming as a civil community its right to live dignified, unarmed, and democratic lives.
Albert Schweitzer was one of the great humanitarian giants of the last century, whose example inspired millions. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. His example and his work goes on, and our next speaker, David Ives, is the Executive Director of the Albert Schweitzer Institute. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to say hi to all the German students that have been going to all the summits for the past couple of years. We finally came back to Germany, and it's a delight to be here. It is a pleasure for me to represent the 1952 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Dr. Albert Schweitzer. Dr. Schweitzer remains familiar to many of you here in Germany and throughout Europe as he was a very famous theologian, philosopher, and musician at the turn of the 20th century. He was famed for his lectures and for his organ recitals, mainly playing the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, often here in Berlin. So I feel a very strong connection to this city. Schweitzer is renowned for giving up his prominence in Europe and becoming a medical doctor ministering to the poor in what was then French Equatorial Africa and is now Gabon. Yet he became even more famous as not that many people in that day and age would go to another country solely to serve the poor and to work to improve the lives of a group of people that had a completely different culture and build bridges instead of walls between Africans and Europeans. He felt his most important philosophy, though, was his idea of reverence for life, which I understand is more accurately translated from the German as to be in awe of life, plants, animals, and humans. It is tough to build a wall or kill a person if you view another person like yourself as an awesome, wondrous human being and deserving of the same rights and privileges. It is a different mindset based on love and deep, deep respect. Nevertheless, there are both metaphorical and physical walls between people, and I hope this summit helps tear some of them down. Last August, I spent some time visiting both Israel and Palestine for the first time since 1998. I wanted to see if there was any way to use Dr. Schweitzer's ideals to bridge the gaps between Palestinians and Israelis or knock down even a tiny part of the walls between them. I did not find much hope. When I went there in 1998, I found that most checkpoints in Israel and the West Bank were sometimes a wooden box and an umbrella to keep the sun's rays off of them. There was a spirit in the air that conveyed the optimism that peace was possible. Now, in those same places, There are hardened concrete bunkers that have replaced the relatively innocuous barriers I remembered. Any glimmers of trust are almost completely gone. In Palestine, I met with about 30 young people who expressed to me their anger at the lack of hope in their lives for a future that would enable them to provide a home, food, and education for their family. They all thought that the world portrayed them negatively in the movies and newspapers and thought that all Palestinians were terrorists. One asked me if I had ever been to the sea and what it was like, since he had never been there before, although it is only about 30 or 40 kilometers away from his home. This is because Israel requires so many passes to be able to get through their checkpoints. Some told me of their friends who still want to become a suicide bomber, and all felt that they had a lack of opportunity for them in the future to get any kind of job. All students felt that Israel did not care what happened to them or to Palestine. In Israel, I came face to face with a wall that had been built around the perimeters of Israel with weird, convoluted diversions in places to envelop sacred spots or other points of significance to the Israelis. It looked like a monstrous scar to me that hadn't healed. I met some farmers that had the wall built through their land, cutting them off from their orchards. Most of the people we met in Israel were from the so-called peace wing of Israeli life. All were despondent as they did not see any real hope for peace. They felt that the Palestinian kids I met were right. The Israelis did not care about what happened in Palestine. They just wanted to be left alone. For peace to occur, everyone has to care about what happens in Palestine. Martin Luther King, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, said that no one was free unless everyone was free. And in Palestine and Israel, there will be no peace unless everyone has peace and justice. I spoke with one person who was the former chief of staff under Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who told me that he had been working on peace in the Middle East for the last 15 to 18 years while in and out of political power. I asked him if he had ever, during that time period, been optimistic about peace. He said no. I asked if he was optimistic about peace now, and he said yes. That surprised me, so I asked why. He said that he was an optimist because he did not want to die a pessimist, and that was his sole reason for optimism. I hope that when he does die, it will be after good, concrete actions have been taken that will give all of us good reasons to be optimistic about peace in the Middle East, and I hope all of you help in that process. I think that a third intifada is coming that may be more brutal than the first two, unless there is some room found somewhere for Palestinians and Israelis to live with dignity. I look forward to the rumored peace plan to be presented by President Obama sometime soon, and I hope it is something that I can support and takes into consideration the need for both sides to be treated as first-class citizens, and neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian side holding enough of power to veto any progressive idea. In my own country, I'm embarrassed by the wall that is slowly being built along our border with Mexico from San Diego to the west, in the west, to Brownsville, Texas, to keep our neighbors in the south in their place. I just returned from two visits. One to Guatemala in the summer to work with the Rigoberta Menchú Foundation building schools for her Mayan people, and last weekend from Nicaragua, where we will be working on building schools there also. Our fence will keep out many of the people that we met in both countries who are working for $1 a day, if that, and some of whom are reduced to making hamburgers out of a combination of clay and soil to eat in their tortillas. One of the teachers we work with asked me plaintively if I could find her a job in the United States, as she made only $4 a day, even with her university degree, which meant that she had to choose whether to buy black plastic to cover the holes in her walls and roof or feed her children. The laborers that are in our countries right now are often exploited and disposable, in part because they are poor and in part because they are viewed as different or as the dangerous other. A strong belief in Schweitzer's system of ethics would prevent people from being perceived as disposable and rather be welcomed into the United States or helped to live in their country with dignity. Instead of building the wall along our border, we should tear down that wall and use that money instead to work together with our Latin American brothers and sisters to provide roads, schools, clinics, and anything else that can provide everyone with a way of life full of pride and honor in oneself. In Guatemala, I also came face to face with the second-class citizenship that has violated much of the indigenous communities. As my students and I entered the village where we were to build a classroom for their school, we had to go to a town meeting to which every resident was invited. We had to assure them, with the help of the representatives from the Rigoberta Menchú Foundation, that we were not there to kidnap their children, nor were we there to take minerals from their sacred mountains. Only then were we allowed to live and work in their community. The Mayan people had too much experience with other white people who looked like me, who had taken advantage of them to the detriment of their way of life, their pride, and their self-esteem. Our students lived with Mayan families, many of whom had never had that intimate contact with white people before. At first, my students were treated with suspicion, but within a day, both the Mayan families and my students, some of whom are here in this audience, were sharing with each other as equals as the Mayans taught my students their language and my students taught them English through rudimentary Spanish. There was a celebration occurring in a dimly lit mud brick home that transcended boundaries and enabled us as equals to connect through some magic of shared experiences and the wonder of a different culture. One can argue that it is hard to tear down these walls between cultures, religions, and ethnic groups. Sometimes it is. But often one can learn to celebrate differences instead of letting our differences divide us. These walls can melt away. If we have reverence for one another, as Schweitzer suggested, perhaps some of these walls can be torn down and we can view each other as absolutely awesome human beings. Thank you.
Let's have the question that we just have time for now. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Estuardo Calderon. I come from Guatemala. I can only agree with what Mr. David Ives has said about my country. My question is how to overcome corrupt politicians, four-year governments, to make a sustainable development, sustainable cross-cultural development of our society, especially within ethnic communities. Thank you.
Would you like to start?
I'll take a shot at that. The answer to your question for me is fairly simple. The thing you have to do to make a difference in terms of development is to educate women. And if you find that happening in whatever country there is, it seems that the women that are more educated are better able to earn a living, take care of their family, and they make a huge difference in the society. So I think educating women is the answer for helping in this area. The other... In your country, in Guatemala, Rigoberta Menchú is one of the answers in terms of how to eliminate corruption. She's trying to become she has been a presidential candidate there, and I think she may run again. And she is doing her very best to be incorruptible in a very difficult situation. So when you have a leader like Rigoberta Menchú, I think you should try to support her as much as possible. She's been, still under tremendous threat upon occasion. 50 people in Guatemala were killed during the last presidential campaign, and so it is a difficult circumstance for her to be in. But when you have a politician and a humanitarian and a leader like Doña Rigoberta, I think she's one of the answers that you should try to support.